This is Demetrius Binrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, the podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And I gotta say, 4th of July is coming up and I'm feeling patriotic. Do you have any cases that will make me feel good about my country?
Oh boy, do I have the case for you just in time for America's foremost patriotic holiday. I have a case that covers everything from the tangled warren of executive privilege to U.S. foreign policy in Latin America to also one of the mini coups we did in the Middle East a couple of times. We're talking this week about Iran-Contra. And so this is going to be a fun one, I think, because, classic 4th of July episode slandering a famous American president. What could go wrong? Send me your hate mail and tell me what can go wrong.
I'm really excited about this one because I am just old enough to have heard this referenced a lot, but I'm not old enough to have actually lived through and remembered what went down. So I'm really excited to learn all of what I'm sure are the very serious details of this one.
Yeah, we're around the same age, and I grew up reading a lot of Dave Barry, which I think explains a lot about me in retrospect. And I remember reading a lot of Iran-Contra jokes when I was 12, and I thought they were funny because it's Dave Barry and he's funny, but I didn't know what it was other than a thing President Reagan had done once that led to some, in retrospect, somewhat problematic Alzheimer's jokes. So I was excited to get to dive into it a little more. But before we get to the scandal, it's Iran-Contra, so we probably talk about Iran and also the Contras. Let's start with Iran. Why does Iran matter here? So, Iran is one of the very few places that technically survived the age of imperialism without getting taken over, but only really technically. At the start of the 20th century, that country, which is still going by Persia at this point, is an independent country, technically, but practically speaking, it is a British puppet state. Britain, for example, marched armies through Persian territory to fight in World War I without asking for permission. Russia also just kind of annexed some bits of it after the Russian Civil War because the British sent troops through Iran to go intervene against the communists. So things are not looking super hot. And in 1925, the last Shah of the existing dynasty, the Qajars, is overthrown. He's replaced by a military leader and officer who led this coup by the name of Reza Khan Pahlavi. So, Pahlavi is a westernizing secularist. He doesn't want a religious government. He's a military man. He wants a strong dictatorship that's going to make Iran into a Western-style great power. He's also really not a fan of the British. They've been kicking his country around for a while, and especially the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company owns a huge amount of the country's economy, most of its oil, because of a deal that was negotiated sort of at gunpoint during the glory days of the British Empire. So, as a result, Reza Khan Pahlavi, he comes to power in the 20s, and by the 40s, he's looking for friends. He's looking for friends against the British in all the wrong places. I can hear the oh no's already. He done palled up with the Nazis. And it didn't work out great for him. At the start of World War II, the British are like, hey, could you not? Could you not? And Reza Khan Pahlavi's response was, what if I did, though? And then the Soviet Union and Great Britain invaded Iran and overthrew the government. I didn't know we did that, or not we, but they. I didn't know the Allies did that. But yeah, Iran got invaded during World War II. The invasion lasted for 5 days before the Iranian army collapsed in the face of the Soviets and British. And Reza Khan Pahlavi is captured by the British, and he dies in a South African prison in 1944.
Okay, that is something that I don't recall learning at all in history class. And we spent, I would say, probably more time on World War II than is technically required for AP Euro.
Yeah, I mean, mixed feelings on this one, because Reza Khan Pahlavi, not a great dude, ran essentially a supposedly independent republic that was functionally a military dictatorship and also palled around with Nazis. And also, a little regime change feels a little problematic. So, I don't know. Let's just sit with that one because it's all downhill from here, baby.
Oh, wait, it's going to get worse and weirder than that?
Oh, America hasn't even shown up yet. Really problematic this bitch up.
When has America ever caused problems in the Middle East, I ask you?
Well, for one, under the reign of the next Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who takes over in 1941 after his dad is deposed by the British. The British wanted to get rid of him altogether and bring back the old Qajar dynasty, but the Qajar heir at this point lived in the United Kingdom and didn't speak Farsi. So they were like, maybe this guy will not fly. So Mohammad Reza Pahlavi becomes the new Shah. He's obsessed with making Iran strong so it can't be pushed around like happened under his father. And he's willing to do basically anything he has to, including crush elected officials who are trying to check his power. Iran technically at this point is a constitutional monarchy. There's the Shah, but there's also an elected legislature. And in 1951, the legislature elects a new prime minister. You might have heard of this guy before. He comes up in a lot of left-wing discussion around Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. So he is the head of something called the National Front, which is this wide-ranging party committed to Iranian nationalism. There's everyone from right-wing Iranians to socialists in the party. They just want to make Iran a strong country, and they fucking hate the British. And so Mossadegh does a bunch of things like nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company to get rid of it because it's way too powerful. He pushes against the legal power of the Shah. He actually gets into a huge constitutional battle over the right to name ministers in 1952. He does a little land reform to try and deal with tenant farming and forcing rural landlords to help pay for things like sanitation and housing and pest control. All pretty popular things, but you know what? You know what all this sounds like to me?
Are you going to say communism?
It sounds like communism. Yeah, it does sound like communism. And you know who else thought that? Dwight Eisenhower.
Oh my God. Okay. All right. And this is okay. So this would be late 40s, early 50s right now?
Early 50s, 1953
Okay.
specifically, the first year of the Eisenhower administration. The United States helps back what's called Operation Ajax, where the army does a little coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, and he dies under house arrest in Iran.
Okay, so we're in primo Red Scare territory right now.
Yes, and so to fight the communists, we overthrow a democratically elected leader in order to strengthen a monarch as his counterpart, which is, of course, the lesson we all learn on the 4th of July, that monarchy is great and in no way problematic.
You know what? Feudalism is many things, but it is not communism. He does have us there.
So Iran gets a little bit repressive after this point. It's a very strange country because it is a liberalized economic country, and it's growing at the same rate actually as South Korea and Taiwan. There's this expectation that it's going to be this major economy like those are today, but it's also a repressive dictatorship with its own secret police, the Savak. And then comes the Iranian Revolution, when in the late 70s the Shah is overthrown because turns out being an authoritarian dictator is not super popular with a lot of people for some reason. Especially when those people get wealthier and can see the standards of living available in other countries where there's a little bit more of that old freedom. So the Iranian Revolution overthrows the Shah in 1978. It's a whole thing. I really want to do more stuff with the Iranian Revolution because there's some great trials that are actually involved in it, but we don't have time for it. Short version, Shah gets overthrown, January 1979. Briefly, there's a democracy. Then the army backstabs that democracy and puts into place a theocratic government, the Islamic Republic of Iran, with the help of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. They're pretty anti-American because we loved the Shah and they didn't love the Shah. But that's not U.S. foreign policy backfiring in our own faces. They just don't know why the Shah was great. Don't worry about it, guys.
So this new government is not a return to the previous order of monarchy. This is an entirely new ideology and new plan. But the Shah is overthrown for good. Is that the way this is going?
Yes, no more Shah, okay. No more monarchy. It's an Islamic republic. So there is kind of an appearance of a civilian government, but the priesthood of Shia Islam, which is the dominant sect of Islam in Iran, has kind of veto power over the government, essentially. So that's Iran. Now let's talk about the Contras, which means we have to talk about a country I'm sure we're all intimately familiar with, Nicaragua.
Oh boy, I bet there's going to be some great Red Scare stuff going on in this
Yeah,
one.
if you know anything about the U.S. foreign policy in Latin America during the Cold War, you know that this is about to get real fucking depressing. So, as we all know, Nicaragua has been an independent country since 1838, and as we all know, fun fact, also a future episode, it was briefly taken over by an American mercenary named William Walker, who just invaded the place in the 1850s and declared himself president. Real interesting guy.
You know what? There was a lot of invading places in the 1800s going around, okay?
You know, when you look at future American foreign policy, really he was just ahead of his time. So, Nicaragua is also, I didn't know this until I started researching this episode, a place the US occupied for like 20 years. In 1909, we overthrew the Nicaraguan government because of we claimed it was threatening US property. Specifically, the government had shot 2 Americans because they joined an anti-government militia, and so we sent in the Marines. And we occupied Nicaragua until 1933.
Wait, are you telling me that, okay, this I also do not remember from history class. We full on occupied this country for 20 years?
Yeah.
Like our army was stationed there 20 years?
We left briefly in, I want to say, 1925, having tried to set up a puppet government there, but then it fell apart pretty quickly, so the Marines went back in, yeah.
Man, I gotta say, I am starting to see why there's some anti-American sentiment going on in this episode.
So, 2 names we have to remember here. First, when the U.S. withdraws, it leaves behind a government dominated by the Somoza family, who are initially wealthy plantation owners. And of course, as we all know with the history of plantations, that makes them in no way problematic. So the Somozas are going to rule Nicaragua for the next half century or so. The other name we need to know is Augusto Cesar Sandino. He's the leader of an anti-US resistance who fights a guerrilla war against the Nicaraguan government until he's assassinated in the mid-30s by pro-US forces. That name Sandino is going to be important, so hang on to it. In fact, the reason the name Sandino is important is because in the 60s, anti-Somoza sentiment crystallizes into something called the Sandinista movement. So these are Nicaraguan nationalists who are very left-wing, don't like the Somozas, by extension don't like the US government because we love the Somozas, and they form something called the FSLN, a Spanish acronym for the Sandinista National Liberation Front, which fights a multi-decade civil war against the Somozas and their dictator at this time, who's Anastasio Somoza Debayle. In 1979, same year the Islamic Republic goes up, the Somozas lose control of the government, the Sandinistas start winning control of the major cities. We also withdrew support from the Somozas under President Jimmy Carter because the Somozas did a few war crimes. They did a little war crimes. Most famously, they did execute a U.S. journalist on live TV once, and that didn't go over super well. So we stopped giving them money to shoot dissidents, and then their government fell apart.
All right, cool and normal things the U.S. has done for
all
the world.
Normal parts of foreign policy. So Somoza flees to Paraguay. He gets assassinated the next year, and there's a new Sandinista government that takes over the Junta of National Reconstruction, led by a guy named Daniel Ortega. But the revolution is not over. There is still a right-wing opposition after this point, and these are the Contras. That's a nickname. It's shorthand for Contra-Revolucion or counter-revolution. They're not really a coherent ideology. Some are pro-Somozas. Some are just like anti-leftist or anti-Sandinista. A few of them are actually indigenous tribes in Nicaragua, like the Miskito and the Mayangna, who actually ran afoul of Sandinista land collectivization efforts. They didn't like having their land forcibly collectivized. And there were even actually a few former Sandinistas who just didn't like the mainstream Sandinistas, who then joined the Contras. So it's a real motley crew.
Look, what would communism be without a bunch of communists trying to kill the other communists?
For not being communist in the right way. Yeah, it's classic.
That's just part of having a communist government.
So, now we come to the man who ties them all together. America's favorite B-list actor. Everyone give it up for Ronald Wilson Reagan. I'll pause for the applause here.
Oh God, man, I'm too fried to like really rip into him the right way.
Oh, don't worry, I have plenty of material. So, Reagan, born February 6, 1911, becomes an actor in the 30s, becomes the head of the Screen Actors Guild in the 40s and 50s, and becomes famous during this period for merrily helping the government to blacklist communists in Hollywood. And communist, according to Reagan, was, I guess, everyone he didn't like. So he leaves acting in the 60s. If you've ever seen any of his movies, you can see why. He's not very good.
Are you saying that the man who famously acted opposite a chimpanzee was not the future leading man of Hollywood?
I'm saying it was a bit presumptuous to start interviewing vice presidential candidates that early.
Oh,
So,
zing.
swish. That's a shot on George Bush Sr., baby. So, Reagan goes into politics in the early 60s. Most famously, he becomes pretty famous in Republican circles in 1964 when he gives a big speech at the RNC during the nomination of everyone's favorite Republican, Barry Goldwater. We all know him well because, of course, he accomplished so very much. And in 1966, Reagan is able to parlay this into being elected governor of California. And this is really where he becomes a conservative hero. He jacks up the taxes a whole bunch to balance the state budget, suppresses the Black Panther Party by signing laws restricting gun carrying rights, goes after student protesters, actually gets one of them killed when he sends in the California State Highway Patrol to Berkeley.
Wait a second. Are you saying this Republican hero became a Republican hero by enacting more gun control laws and jacking up taxes?
But he did it to own the libs, Demetria.
I'm just saying.
But the libs were owned, Demetria.
Okay, I will concede that the libs were well owned by doing exactly the same thing that liberals are advocating for today.
I spent a decent amount of time reading about Ronald Reagan over the last week or so, and from what I can tell, his politics are mainly he hates everyone who's a leftist. I don't know that there's much coherent to them beyond that.
You know what? I know a lot of leftists who hate everyone who's a leftist too. So are we really sure Ronald Reagan is not the true leftist icon?
Oh man, say that at a Workers of the World meeting. I'm sure that'll go over great. So, as he's governor, this is where he really pioneers a lot of his politics. And he's angling for a run for presidency pretty early. He actually goes for it first in 1968, but gets rolled by a clever politician by the name of Tricky Dick Nixon. He goes against Gerald Ford in 1976, does a little bit better because Ford is not as good of a politician and just barely loses the primary. And then, of course, in 1980, he takes advantage of a recession, handily wins the presidential primary for the Republicans, and then goes after Jimmy Carter, among other things, accusing him of having lost Iran, lost Nicaragua, being soft on the communists. He's also the one who really pioneers shitty racist dog whistles to basically say, I don't like black people getting government assistance. He is the progenitor or the popularizer of the phrase welfare queen.
Yes, that is actually a case. We may cover that on the show. There's an entire book about it, which is very fascinating.
I would like to make it a part of this show's mission to destroy the reputation of Ronald Reagan. So if we could do that, I would really appreciate it.
Okay, so I feel like there's no better way to destroy the reputation of Ronald Reagan than continuing to say that he championed many leftist policies.
Well, you know what else he championed?
What's
the
that?
Contras. He loved the Contras. Reagan believes in fighting communism everywhere. I have a quote here from that 1964 RNC speech. It's called the Time for Choosing speech. That kind of goes into this a little bit. Quote, "There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second. Surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us the greatest risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement, and it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender."
Okay, so that right there is, I'm sure, a very stirring speech for an actor to give, but it is also some of the worst foreign policy advice I've ever heard.
Yeah, turns out don't ever back down and confront people everywhere can get a little complicated, like with the Iran-Contra deal. So, Reagan believes this fully and completely, and this becomes part of what's called the Reagan Doctrine, which he doesn't formally articulate until 1985, but even before then, it's pretty clear his goal is to support a rollback of communism, that's what he calls it, anywhere he can support democratic, which really just means not communist reform or revolution, he'll do it. And he really, like, the Contras are dear to his heart, and I do not understand why. He did describe them, and this is a direct quote, as the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. And really, like, he basically was willing to do anything to support these guys. He orders the CIA to offer them clandestine support without congressional approval. He cuts a deal with the Argentine government, which at this point is a right-wing military junta that is backed by the US, to launder that aid so Congress can't find it. And he turns a blind eye to things the Sandinistas do. Just like the Founding Fathers, they are, of course, famous for targeted assassination of their political opponents and also for selling cocaine to fund their war, which is why we do a rail of coke off the American flag every 4th of July.
Somewhere an eagle just shed a single cocaine-laced tear.
So, meanwhile, we have Iran. On the paper, Reagan does not like them very much. They're a very anti-US government. He extends a Carter administration decision to block arms sales to the new Iranian government, which is actually a big issue, because we built the Iranian military back when it was a US puppet state, and so their whole military is dependent on tools that only we make the spare parts for.
Militarily, the US is kind of like one of those printer companies that sends in the printer with the sample ink cartridges.
And you know how that's worked out for our military industrial complex? Great. Welcome to the city Boeing built, baby.
Now sponsored by Raytheon.
Oh my god. Can you imagine? So
yeah, I'm sure that all of the weapons manufacturers are looking for those big bucks sponsoring this podcast.
Hey, you never know. There could be some dictators getting their ideas from us. They could be put, that's a demographic Raytheon wants to reach. There's money to be made there.
I gotta say, we have a pretty comprehensive what not to do list for any potential dictators out there. We've sort of stress tested dictatorship.
And that's our marketing now. So, the other reason that military embargo matters is because of the Iran-Iraq War, a war that, of course, most Americans don't know happened. Or I would wager a good number of Americans don't know Iran and Iraq are different countries. They are next to each other, so that's kind of confusing. But after the Iranian Revolution, Iraq invaded Iran, basically because they're worried about the new religious government there trying to attack Iraq. Iraq at this point is a kind of secular militarist dictatorship, led, of course, by the famously unproblematic Saddam Hussein. He's worried that he's going to get shot, and so he wants to take out the Iranians so they won't back people trying to overthrow him.
Boy, that sounds like a man who'd love to buy some of our weapons.
Future episode, baby. So the Iran-Iraq War is an 8-year stalemate. It kills 500,000 people. It's super depressing. The Iranians use literal child soldiers to fight at several points. The Iraqis drop a bunch of chemical weapons on both civilian centers and on the Iranian military. It's pretty fucked up. But it also means there's a big demand in Iran for American weapons because that's what their military uses. So, 1982. Ronald Reagan is stirring the pot around the globe, making friends, winning enemies. There's a bit of a recession, though, because it turns out his economic policies not super effective.
Are you saying that busting all of the unions at the same time that you're attacking welfare is not the best thing for the American people?
I would never say that because I'm an American patriot. But it does mean that the Democrats win pretty big in the midterms that year. As a result, they extend their control of the House, and they start to push back against Reagan's policies, especially in foreign policy, which is kind of a trend in the 70s and 80s after Vietnam, which is this big kind of cock up where the president is given a lot of leeway and leads us into a war we technically didn't really need to fight at all. Congress starts to try and reassert itself a little bit, which will happen really up until the war on terrorism. And at the same time this is happening, the US press is starting to report on some of the more problematic aspects of the Contras, all that terrorism and that cocaine, and the civil war that is dragging on because the US is backing the Contras rather than ending and allowing Nicaragua to be peaceful. And so Congress passes something called the Boland Amendment, which is named for Edward Boland, who's the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. He's a Democrat from Massachusetts. And basically what the Boland Amendment says is that the U.S. government can't give direct aid to the Contras for purpose of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government, but aid for other purposes is allowed. Right?
Okay, I'm seeing a pretty big loophole that you could drive some tanks through here.
Is it that, in fact, you can offer aid to the Contras without the explicit goal of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government because that's just the whole point of the Contras, and so they're going to do it anyway?
You know what? Sometimes, you got to offer aid to your friends around the world, and what they do with all that weaponry is their business. We're just here to help.
You would be a perfect lawyer in the Reagan administration. I don't know how you feel about knowing that. That is the exact argument that Reagan used to say, "Oh, we're giving aid to the Contras out of the kindness of our heart, and if they happen to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, these things happen in life."
Reagan, he's so famous for just freely giving aid to his friends. He's so open-hearted. He just really wants to give it away.
A man of true charity. You know what he charitably gave a lot to the Contras? Rocket launchers, which they used to launch a rocket attack on the port of Corinto, which blows up an oil stockpile, but also a bunch of medicine shipments and forces the evacuation of 25,000 people. He also gave them airplanes that they used to bomb the main airport of Managua, which is the capital of Nicaragua. And this is the real fun one, the CIA didn't help the Sandinistas do this. We did, the actual CIA by ourselves, mine Nicaragua's harbors on the order of the Reagan administration. At first, the Reagan admin is going to claim the Contras do this, but actually the Wall Street Journal uncovers the truth that the CIA did. And that's an act of war, fun fact. It was also recommended by a member of the president's staff, part of his National Security Council, by the name of Oliver North, which is a name we're going to come back around to.
Okay, wait a second. So, hang on. If a federal unit like the CIA commits an act of war, despite there being a law saying that they cannot give aid to this organization for the purpose of overthrowing a government, did the CIA break the law? Can the CIA be prosecuted? What is going on here legally?
No one's ever tried, but I honestly wonder what kind of case you could make there, whether they'd violated the Constitution by committing an act of war without Congress declaring war first, but no one's ever tried to litigate it.
This isn't even the criminal case that we're covering in this?
Oh, no. We're just getting started, baby.
Oh my God. Okay, let's plow on.
All right, so a lot of people are a little peeved about this. Actually, some Republicans now, like Barry Goldwater, who is now a senator from Arizona, and who is starting to get the impression, for some reason, that the Reagan administration is playing fast and loose with the Boland Amendment. I don't know why anyone would think that.
I can't think of any reasons at all.
So, in 1984, Congress forces through what's called Boland II, or the Second Boland Amendment. I will read you the main text. No appropriation or funds made available pursuant to this bill to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activity may be obligated or expended for the purpose or which would have the effect of supporting, directly or indirectly, military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua by any nation, group, organization, movement, or individual. So it's trying to close the loophole, essentially, right? None of this money can be used to do any kind of flim-flammery in Nicaragua, even if it's indirect, even if your friends just happen to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. Not allowed.
I don't see any possible way this could go wrong.
So this is where we finally get to Iran-Contra. So Ronald Reagan tries a couple of ways to get around this. He will try and convince other countries to launder aid money to the Contras. Like, he'll give them the aid money if they pass it along. Turns out not a lot of takers on that one. He also tries to get individuals to fundraise to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, which is somewhat successful, but doesn't get a lot of money for it. But Reagan is undeterred. The phrase he says to his national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, is, "I want you to do whatever you have to help keep these people, body and soul, together." So, 1985 is when McFarlane comes up with an idea. And here's the idea. See if you can follow. The US government is going to sell weapons to Iran. The reason we're going to do this, in violation of our own embargo of Iran that we forced other countries to sign on to, is because Iran is connected to Hezbollah, which is fighting a civil war in Lebanon and has kidnapped a bunch of American civilians in Lebanon. And if we give the Iranians weapons, they'll let the civilians go. Israel can launder those weapons for us because they're also a little suspicious of the Iranians, so we can trust them. And this should work just fine. It doesn't. Hezbollah lets go of 3 hostages after the Iranians get some weapons, but then just takes 3 more. And eventually McFarlane is going to resign in 1985. And then it's his replacement, John Poindexter, and one of his subordinates, a Marine lieutenant colonel named Oliver North, who come up with the actual Iran-Contra plan. Here's the plan. We're going to keep selling weapons to the Iranians, but this time we're going to mark them up. We're not going to sell at market value. We're going to jack the price up. We're then going to pocket the money we make from the Iranians. Rather than putting it back into the US budget balance, which is what you're supposed to do, we're just going to redirect it through the National Security Council to fund the Contras without having to get money from Congress, which won't give us money to fund the Contras right now.
Wow, okay. This is some pretty wild spreadsheet shenanigans right here. Can you do that with a budget? I mean, wouldn't people
Not
notice
legally.
those, hundreds of millions of dollars ending up in the wrong country?
The thing is, you can classify a lot of this stuff on national security grounds, so it's pretty hard to actually investigate. But it's not supposed to work that way, no.
I am really falling down on the job of doing our taxes and not just turning in a slip of paper saying it's classified. I feel like we could get out of a lot of taxes by just writing it's classified and refusing to disclose anything.
Have you tried selling our taxes to the Iranian government in exchange for hostages?
You know what? That was my mistake. I really got to talk to the CPA about that.
So, the Iranians are, of course, a little cheesed about this because the prices are getting jacked up, but they're what you call a captive audience because they can't buy from anyone else because we've told every other country to embargo weapons sales to Iran. So that's cool.
That's business, baby.
So yeah, that's Iran-Contra. From January to November 1986, there's a series of sales between the two sides. Ties are always pretty complicated. At one point, Robert McFarlane and Oliver North will go to Iran in May of 1986 to try and open things up in terms of discussions. But then they're fobbed off on some minor functionaries. They get into a whole fight with the Iranians sent to negotiate them. And McFarlane's just like, fuck you guys, I'm leaving. But that's the actual Iran-Contra like scandal itself, is weapons to the Iranians, money from the Iranians, funnel the money illegally to the Contras so the Contras can overthrow the Nicaraguan government.
Okay, that's a pretty fucking big scandal, and I'm a little surprised that this one didn't take down Reagan himself, because it seems like he was pretty involved in signing off on this kind of aid, right?
Me fucking too. And it only lasts about 10 months is really the thing, from January to October 1986. Because in October, a flight going over Nicaragua carrying weapons and also a U.S. Marine guarding them by the name of Eugene Hassenfuss is shot down by the Nicaraguan government. Hassenfuss is captured. He's tried by the Nicaraguans. He's eventually pardoned and released, but not before they get a bunch of testimony from him about what the U.S. is doing in Nicaragua. and in particular, admitting that the US government is still delivering weapons to the Contras. Though when this happens, the Reagan administration will deny that this is happening. They'll say he's working for a private company, that he's not officially a US employee anymore.
Okay, so the Sandinistas have just blown up the US's spot, and the US responds with "nuh-uh."
Yeah, we hired someone to do it. It's not us. Then the next month, someone in the Iranian government, we think it was in the Iranian government, leaked dealings about the whole scandal to a Lebanese newspaper. We actually don't know who leaked this. There's some suspicion that it was an Iranian Revolutionary Guard official named Mehdi Hashemi, who was very opposed to the whole deal, and it was executed the next year for sedition. And it's thought maybe that's why. Seymour Hersh, the famous journalist, will say that he had been told anonymously. I want to stress this is anonymous because there's no proof. That actually it had been an admiral in the US Navy, Arthur Moreau, who leaked the information to a Lebanese paper because he believed the Iran-Contra program had grown completely out of proportion and had to be shut down. But we just don't know for sure. When it finally leaks, the Iranian government confirms the story. Reagan gives an address on November 13th, 1986, and basically says, yeah, I sent some weapons, but I'm just trying to make peace to win over the Iranians. Don't even sweat it. And then he just doesn't talk to the press for 5 months, and then eventually does admit that, yeah, we do a little arms dealing as a treat.
Okay, so it sounds like someone has broken the law here. Quite a few laws, perhaps even some international laws.
Oh, we're about to break some more. Because starting November 21st, so math in my head, 8 days after, no. Yeah, 8 days after Reagan said, I didn't do anything wrong, Oliver North starts busily shredding a bunch of documents that could be incriminating, so many that he jams his paper shredder several times. His secretary, Fawn Hall, would claim that North made her smuggle documents illegally out of the old executive office building inside of her clothes so she could dispose of them in a more efficient and untraceable way. North would also testify that he saw the National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, destroying documents, including the signed copies of orders from Reagan authorizing the Iran-Contra program. It's grim. It's grim shit, man.
This is quite. I knew that this was a scandal. I didn't realize quite the level of scandal going on here. This is the kind of whoopsie that seems like it would take down the whole administration.
Yeah, and in the immediate aftermath, there are hearings into it. The Reagan administration launches its own investigation, the Tower Commission, which is led by retired Senator John Tower. But it's the administration investigating themselves. Surprisingly, they don't find that Reagan did anything wrong.
Well, did they ask the most important question, which was, did that do anything to fight communism?
I don't believe they did, actually. Basically, what they say is that the program was not given enough of a hearing before the president because, of course, he didn't know about it, and that too much power was handed over to the NSC, which is supposed to be an advisory board. My favorite quote from it, by the way, quote, President Reagan's personal management style places an especially heavy responsibility on his key advisors. Knowing his style, they should have been particularly mindful of the need for special attention to the measures in which the arms sales initiative developed and proceeded. So basically, you can't trust Reagan to pay attention to things like this.
So the way Ronald Reagan is going to get out of culpability here is, I don't know what my government's doing.
Look, the buck stops kind of over there somewhere. Can you blame me for losing track of one international arms deal? So then there are congressional hearings in both the House and the Senate, led by the two intelligence committees. The Senate one is noteworthy because it is led by one of the most badass senators in American history, Medal of Honor recipient Daniel Inouye from Hawaii. The House one is notable because its leading Republican member is one representative from Wyoming by the name of Mr. Richard Cheney, who spends the entire time just really filleting the shit out of the Reagan administration.
That's a man who knows a thing or two about arms deals.
Yeah, so the majority report from these commissions is pretty damning. Basically what they say is that these people lied to Congress, they lied to cabinet officials, they lied to the public. And that the president, if he didn't know about this, then he tolerated an environment where people were allowed to just play fast and loose with the law, and that you have to go above the law, and that that's just like corrosive to good government, which it is. So well spotted.
What about Oliver North, who's really getting thrown under the bus here? Is he willing to go down for the ship with the ship, or is he going to turn around and say Reagan knew about everything? This is all his fault to try to save himself.
Oliver North will testify before this committee, essentially call it illegitimate. He will basically say, actually, I have a quote from his speech here. This is what him addressing Congress when he's subpoenaed. This is Oliver North. One thing is, I think for certain, that you will not investigate yourselves in this matter. There is not much chance he will conclude at the end of these hearings that the Boland amendments and the frequent policy changes therefore were unwise, or that your restrictions should not have been imposed on the executive branch. You are not likely to conclude the administration acted properly by trying to sustain the freedom fighters in Nicaragua when they were abandoned, and you are not likely to conclude by commending the President of the United States, who tried valiantly to recover our citizens and achieve an opening with strategically vital Iran. Some here have attempted to criminalize policy differences between co-equal branches of government and the executive's conduct of foreign affairs. I believe it is inevitable that Congress will in the end blame the executive branch, but I suggest to you that Congress must accept at least some blame in the Nicaraguan freedom fighters' matter. Plain and simple, Congress is to blame because of the fickle, vacillating, unpredictable, on again, off again policy towards the Nicaraguan democratic resistance, the so called Contras.
So he's going for the bold strategy of, yeah, we broke the law, but really, isn't not you who is breaking the true law of fighting communism.
It is like some of the most tortured logic I've ever seen. Aren't you really at fault for making us break the law by creating the conditions where we would want to do that to accomplish our objectives?
Well, that is certainly an interesting defense. So this is what he says in this inquiry, but is he actually put on trial?
He is. So, after this all comes to light, almost immediately the Attorney General opens an investigation, and so too does the Independent Counsel. So, after Watergate in 1978, Congress sets up a special prosecutor to handle government misconduct. This is the same role, it's been reorganized a little bit, but that Bob Mueller would later hold, investigating Russia's involvement in the 2016 election. Joseph Walsh is the counselor at this time. He's a former judge, a former Wall Street lawyer, and he begins investigating the scandal. As an independent prosecutor, he can do this, and he creates 13 separate indictments for people involved in the Iran-Contra affair. None of them go to Ronald Reagan.
So what is his logic there? Is he buying this? Oh, Reagan just wasn't paying attention.
Nobody can prove that Reagan knew, right? North would testify that the orders he'd received from Reagan had been shredded. Reagan would say, I never authorized this program and I think it was a mistake. But these people believed they were doing the right thing and shouldn't be treated badly for it. And no one can say who's lying, so there wasn't enough evidence to actually go after Reagan himself.
Wow. Okay. So this is back in the day of if that paper gets shredded, that's done. It's over. There is no more record of it.
By the way, you know who else totally didn't know about this? The vice president and former CIA director, George Herbert Walker Bush, who's gearing up to run for election at this point because he's going to take over for Reagan. No, only 13 people are indicted. Now, Demetria, let's play the Price is Right. Closest without going over, of these 13 people, how many of them will actually do jail time?
Oh, I'm afraid the answer is going to be 0.
That's pessimistic. The answer is 1.
Oh, all right. Wow. My faith in the country is restored. One person did jail time.
Yes, one person did jail time for the Iran-Contra affair. His name is Thomas Clines. He was a CIA officer who helped with Thalat weapons smuggling, and basically he's jailed for concealing additional profits that he made for selling those weapons to the Contras. He put them in a foreign bank account to evade taxes instead of giving them to the US government, and he will serve 16 months in a federal prison for it.
Wait a second. So the only guy who goes down in this entire affair is the one who is like, well, I'm doing crimes. Why don't I just do a little extra crime on the top?
Yeah, you know what? At this point, like, I feel like this is the least problematic thing that's happening, that a CIA officer is double dipping a little bit.
You know that one crime at a time rule? I feel like if he had merely supplied weapons to and aid to a foreign government, that would have been one thing. It's the tax evasion that really got him.
So, I mean, isn't that the real crime here? Isn't the balance book of the American government, that's really what's at stake? Not, like the soul of democracy or anything. Anyway, a bunch of other people who are indicted are flipped by the prosecution, like Fawn Hall, Oliver North's secretary. A few are pardoned by George H.W. Bush when he takes office. That's what happens to Caspar Weinberger and Robert McFarlane. Some take plea bargains, a few get probation. Oliver North is one of the only ones who actually goes to trial. So, let's talk really quickly about Oliver North's trial. So he is indicted on March 17th, 1988. Between him and Poindexter, who were indicted at the same time, 23 counts of criminal conspiracy, as well as conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government by pocketing money from those transactions. In particular, the indictment says that arms sales to Iran generated $30 million, and that the U.S. government only got $12 million of that money. So the other 18 went to the Contras or was pocketed by people involved in the program.
Wait, only 18 million? That's okay. I gotta say, on the scale of US government spend, that is a surprisingly small amount of money. I mean, I know that inflation has happened since then, but like on the sheer scale of the US defense budget, that is a tiny drop in the bucket. Like that much crime for that little profit, that's ridiculous.
The price of revolution is very reflective of consumer price indices. It's a cheaper cost of living, so it's a cheaper cost to overthrow the government.
Okay, I guess they were getting a great value for the money. Although, did they actually successfully overthrow the government?
No, they didn't. We'll get to that in a second. So,
all right.
North is also indicted for obstructing a presidential inquiry by destroying documents, astonishingly. The trial will take about a year to open. It won't start till February 21st, 1989, because the Reagan administration stalls it for months, claiming it is worried about classified intelligence being leaked as a part of the trial process. The trial only goes forward when the Attorney General signs a deal where that prosecutor, Walsh, can see secret documents and can handle them in the courtroom, but no one else can. And the Attorney General at any time can say, actually, I don't want you to see this document, and just yank it. And because of this, 2 of the charges have to be dropped, because without that evidence, or without evidence that is yanked by the Reagan administration, they can't be sustained. Even so, North is convicted pretty quickly. In May of 1989, he's convicted on 3 out of 12 charges and sentenced in July, a 3-year suspended prison sentence, 2 years of probation, 1,200 hours of community service with inner city drug projects, and a fine of $150,000.
Wow, that seems like he got off pretty light considering all of those crimes he definitely did do and get convicted for.
He did also have his pension taken away and was barred from holding federal office, but honestly, a pretty light sentence overall. The rationale from the judge, Gerhard Gessel, was, quote, "The indictment involves your participation in particular covert events. I do not think that in this area you were a leader at all, but really a low-ranking subordinate working to carry out initiatives of a few cynical superiors. You came to be the main point man in a very complex power play developed by higher-ups. Whether it was because of the excitement and the challenge or because of conviction, you responded certainly willingly and sometimes even excessively to their requirements. Along the way, you came to accept, it seems to me, the mistaken view that Congress couldn't be trusted and that the fate of the country was better left to a small inside group, not elected by the people, who were free to act as they chose while publicly professing to act differently. Thus, you became part of a scheme that reflected a total distrust in some constitutional values."
So what the judge is saying here is that, yes, you did do all those crimes and you are super guilty of all of those crimes, but the way that our military system works created a situation in which you felt that the best thing for the country was to do all of the crimes.
Yeah, honestly, I think Gessel's got his number pretty well here. Towards the end, he says, I think you knew this was morally wrong, but under the stress of the moment, it was easier to choose the role of the martyr. Basically, like, you knew this was not the right thing to do, but you also wanted to be a hero. And you thought, you like convinced yourself that destroying these documents was heroic because it was for the fight against communism.
Okay, so this is actually a pretty interesting legal argument going on here, because it is suggesting, because there are in the legal system, there are some sort of allowances that can be made for someone who does think that they're genuinely doing the right thing. So this is a pretty wild example of it, but this is a case where the judge is saying, you know what, you thought that you were doing the right thing by doing a lot of crimes.
Yeah, but here's the thing, it doesn't actually matter. His conviction was overturned.
What? Okay. All right. Never mind. I was going to wax philosophical about the way our justice system works, but never the fuck mind, I guess.
Nope. He appealed. The ACLU backed him because the prosecution, they claim, made improper use of testimony he'd given to Congress under condition of immunity, which therefore couldn't be counted against North in the jury deliberations.
Oh, I'm sure that was it was very important not to set that precedent, but also, damn, that's a bummer.
Yeah, so now Oliver North is still around. He is a dipshit Republican talking head. I did a search for some of his interviews. I found one from 2022 with Crosswalk, which I think is a Christian magazine, which was promoting his trashy spy novels that he wrote during the Bush administration about having to fight the Iraqis and chase down nuclear weapons.
This guy went on to a career as a spy novelist?
I mean, let's be real. It's totally ghost written.
No, okay. Oh my God. I'm going to go look up his books right now.
The one that this was about is called the Jericho Sanction. I also found an interview with Cigar Aficionado from 2001 where he talks about 9/11 and claims that Osama bin Laden is already dead. So, real win there. He's not dead yet, but Barack Obama's coming for him.
Oh, wait. Oh my God. The Jericho Sanction is a novel about Iraq.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, he wrote I believe the main character, who's totally not a stand-in for Oliver North, his wife is kidnapped while living in Jerusalem, also by like living next to some hot Israelis, because that means that they're not racist, I guess. And then he has to go like chase her down and also uncover the totally real Iraqi WMD program that it really definitely exists.
So this guy weasels his way out of a conviction and then goes ahead and decides to make his career writing political fan fiction.
Yeah.
You know what? I can't say I respect it, but I am impressed by it.
So, that's the Iran-Contra affair. If you're wondering, we did not succeed in overthrowing the government of the Sandinistas, but they lose an election in 1990 and step down peacefully. Shockingly. They are back. Daniel Ortega is still the leader of the Sandinistas. He's had like a weird theocratic Christian turn lately, which has been a little bit strange for a guy who started off as a communist, but whatever. Also, by the way, Nicaragua took us to court in the International Criminal Court for all of this. Did win, but there's no way for them to enforce it because we're not ICC members and we can veto anything they put into the UN security or before the UN General Assembly because we're on the Security Council. So they dropped the case in 1992 in exchange for concessions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. I feel like we're getting more and more into international court cases and how some of those work. And there are some ways that you can absolutely win an international court case, and yet nothing happens. There's no actual enforcement.
Yeah, it turns out it's very hard to hold the U.S. accountable for stuff in the International Criminal Court because we can just tell you to go fuck yourselves. And it's America. What are you going to do?
Taking that Russia strategy, I see.
So yeah, that's the Iran-Contra affair. There's a lot to unpack, obviously.
All right, which suitcase are we unzipping first?
I mean, the thing that really got to me here was honestly some of the rhetoric from guys like North or other Republicans. This whole like North is a martyr who's a patriot and being treated badly. Reagan broke the rules but was trying to do the right thing. Ultimately, we have to fight the communists. A lot of that rhetoric honestly sounds a lot like the shit you still hear Republicans say about Donald Trump. That like, oh, so and so is just being martyred because it's all of this grand conspiracy against the Republican Party. And really, like, I guess the sort of conspiratorial mindset of anytime the Republicans get caught doing something bad, it's because the Democrats are out to get them. Like, it's so old. This was 40 fucking years ago, and it's basically the same rhetoric. Also, I really fucking hate Oliver North. I just want to point that out there.
That's a really interesting observation. I was thinking actually as a 90s and 2000s child that it seemed very of the 2000s post 9/11 era. I hadn't realized how far back some of that rhetoric went because I feel like I only really became aware of that. Whatever the US military does is good because the US military is doing it. I thought that that was something that had started in the 2000s. I did not realize that in the 80s we were going, well, I kind of knew that. I should have known that because I knew that the US was intervening in quite a lot of world affairs, but I didn't realize how developed some of that rhetoric was.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out this has really been like this long running part of U.S. foreign policy, going back to overthrowing Nicaragua's government in 1909. Um, it's pretty messed up. I mean, you really do get to understand why the U.S. does not have a particularly great reputation in parts of the world. I will admit I'm not a huge fan of the current Iranian government. I think most sane people should not be, but the Shah was not what I would call a better alternative there. But he wasn't a communist, so it's all good.
Yeah, I wanted to ask actually a bit about just the sort of the proxy war era, which I feel like a lot of the US's fight against communism was choosing small countries that we thought that we could influence or win wars in and just having kind of proxy wars instead of going after the big guys. What was the military reasoning behind that strategy there?
I
Because
mean,
it sure as hell did not work.
a lot of it, to my understanding, is like straight up domino theory stuff. Like if Nicaragua falls, next is the rest of Central America, that level. And just the notion that like it's this very sort of like schoolyard movie shtick of like, son, if you give ground to bullies, they'll just keep taking it. And that's why you have to have the dramatic scene where you punch the bully in the face. Right. It's very much that attitude just crystallized into foreign policy that like if you are seen as weak by the Soviets, they will take advantage. So you always have to hit them back. Which I do want to note is also the same rhetoric the Japanese government used to justify Pearl Harbor in 1941. So that shit can really backfire on you. Yeah, I mean the thing that really I keep coming back to here, like we do a little clowning on the U.S. in this episode, but I want to be clear. Like, I consider myself an American patriot. Like, I like the values this country was built on, though I don't think we do a good job of living up to them. And one of those values is the idea of checks and balances and accountability, right? And like this was not that. This was the imperial presidency, right? It's the presidency seizing more and more power over the affairs of state, sidelining Congress, and really continuing to try and do that as Congress is trying to reassert itself. And I think that is really dangerous, both because it breaks down the system of checks and balances, which is a big part of keeping this country like not a dictatorship, and also because like those values of oversight and limited government are kind of what make America what it is, right? Like, so real talk, like Oliver North's not a great dude. These people were all not great dudes, and also like even if you think supporting the Contras is the right thing, this is not the right way to do that. Because it's undercutting what actually makes America what it's supposed to be. That's my soapbox.
Thank you for that soapbox.
If you could put the Star Spangled Banner back over that, I'd really appreciate it. And in the meantime, if folks want to send us their reviews of Oliver North's various books, where can they find us?
You can find us on our website, facingbackward.com.
Or on Tumblr at tumblr.com/blog/facingbackward.
And this show is made possible by our generous patrons. And we are definitely not laundering your money through a complicated series of arms deals in order to destabilize governments around the world. We are definitely not doing that. And we want to shout out our patrons at our shout out tier, whose money is definitely not going to fund foreign insurgencies. They are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCullough, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hreshka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, An Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked.
Until next time, folks, please do not buy Oliver North's books. He has way too much money. Get them from a public library instead.
I'm looking up Oliver North's books right now. I want to know more. Oh, Tragic Consequences, the price America is paying for rejecting God and how to reclaim our culture for Christ.
That's the least surprising thing I have ever heard.
Let me find out how I'm ruining America. I'll get this from the library just to be extra communist.